Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon when you were watching this webinar. I want to say hello to my good friends and colleagues from South Dakota. This is Dave Nagel again, looking forward to touching base with all of you next week. Some of you might be watching this after November 2nd, but this was just one of the additional supports that Sam and I and the group talked about that has been kind of called for by some. So this is a little bit of a review and overview again of unwrapping the standards. And if there's one piece that if I could press rewind again and maybe do differently, we'll spend a little bit more time and go a little bit deeper with unwrapping. And it's one of those kind of teeter-totter effects where that's always a desire that we want to go deeper with some topics. But one thing that I knew going in, excuse me, was that we had the 4 full days and then the implementation days as we're coming back together here in November and then December. So it's kind of a balance between let's look at the big picture and then go back deeper. So as always, anytime you have a thought or a question, want me to look at one of your CFAs, please do not hesitate to shoot me an email, pick up the phone and give me a call. A couple of you did that. Just called me randomly. You didn't let me know you were calling, and I appreciate that. If I'm available, I'll talk. And I just want to kind of go out there and say no one is busier than a classroom teacher, so I'm never too busy. If I can't take the call, I won't. But if you want to schedule a call, you can do that. But also you could just shoot me an email, and I'll be happy to respond as soon as I can. Going to jump right in and always come back to this kind of overarching statement that any assessment really comes down to these 3 points. What is our purpose? And then when do we have enough evidence to make an inference? And we do this every day in life with almost everything we do. When we're driving to work, we're making an inference from looking at the clock and the time and the traffic to know if we can make our stop for coffee. And sometimes we make an inference that we can't do that. We make an inference when students walk in the classroom, which ones are going to be a little bit rambunctious today, and we separate kids from each other. And certainly we need to make inferences from evidence as to whether or not they are mastering the content they need to, or how far away are they, or how close are they to getting it. And so when we review and we look at where this comes in the design process, and one of the things that I want to emphasize is we've kind of followed through and with probably not anywhere near the level of detail and deep level of teaching that I needed to in those 4 days, because teaching can't place unless there's deep levels of learning. We've hit all 10 steps in sort of a prescribed order. Now it's important that we can conceptualize the learning and see how they all fit together and realize that we're going to look at these differently from our point of view and our perspective. And so for some of us, this is a great place to just stop and realize what drives creating any of our assessment questions or items is the unwrapping. We're not ignoring the big ideas or essential questions. We're not ignoring the other pieces, but we're going to talk a lot about how the unwrapping drives the item writing. So this first webinar, we're kind of review on the unwrapping. We'll pyramid into the next one when we look at the item writing. So our learning intentions for this particular session is to understand the importance, and I think we do, of identifying learning targets and accurate rigor levels from our academic standards, specifically the science standards in South Dakota. And then you as the learners will know that you've met that learning intention when you can complete the success criteria. You can state why unwrapping is such a critical step in any assessment design, determine how to deconstruct a standard by identifying the concepts and skills, and then the accurate rigor levels that students must be demonstrating how that standard is written for what you are currently teaching. So this is a time, if you're watching it in a group, you're watching it for the first time, you're welcome to pause the recording. I'm not going to pause much longer than a few seconds. Feel free to do so. But your personal definition of cognitive rigor. Welcome back. And again, I'm assuming anyone watching it is pausing it as long as they need for their particular learning needs. So we talked a little bit about, when we were together, the myths of rigor, that rigor is not about homework or even more work. And there's kind of that myth that the quantity of work equals rigor. That some students can't do it because they're deficient in skills or their special education, etc. Or that if I have to support them along the way, that it loses its rigor level. We think about athletics and competition and different performing tasks. We don't look at the rigor difficulty of hitting a pitch baseball indifferently just because we start with putting the ball on the tee and then we do soft toss and lob it in underhand, eventually build up that skill. And even when kids are learning how to hit a baseball, sometimes we got to back up and go back to hitting it off the tee. And my goodness, Major League Baseball players hit the ball off a tee every day to kind of get their swing down. So just because I have to support you early until you're able to get it doesn't mean that it's lost its rigor level. And we'll examine depth of knowledge or rigor level by looking at depth of knowledge. And that's the degree to which the complexity of the knowledge is reflected in the content standards. So mass, gravity, cells, DNA, how that content is reflected and how complex does a student need to understand that content to respond to an assessment based on how the standard is written. And while there's some real strong, I think, guidelines for this, this isn't a perfect or exact science, but certainly we can get very close to looking at that standard and determining, okay, based at the rigor level I can see, is my assessment not only aligned to that, but allow me to determine if students aren't completely getting it, how far away might they be? And so as a footnote, I just want to push and remind everybody, and as the consideration, and this is a shift for a lot of us, it's not about 80%. And, we can write an assessment with, 10 items with very strong, very rigorous questions, and students could get 6 of them correct. Or very easy items, and they could get 10 of them correct, or 9. Students only got 6 on a more rigorous question, might be developing and showing more mastery. So we got to be very, very cautious of not letting the grading and those things get in the way. We'll talk more about that, but I just wanted to add that little footnote. And it's also a time to acknowledge that we're ready to thank Benjamin for his time, but we're not looking at Bloom's taxonomy like we are depth of knowledge. And in Bloom's taxonomy, the difficulty is determined by the verb. In DOK, it's determined by the cognitive demand and how that verb will be applied and the thinking required around the content, which is why I think as science teachers, this is a chance to really augment the content that we're teaching, but focus on some areas at times more than others. And again, the assessment question determines the demand, not the student work, not the amount of time or work or quantity of responses that students have to put in, but the assessment question itself. And as we talked a little bit, is kind of, getting in the ballpark. DOK 1 correct answer, 1 right answer. Depth of knowledge 2, there might be a correct answer, but there's an application. I've got to justify it. There's a precipice between DOK 2 and 3. We're getting into strategic thinking, and there's more than 1 right answer. Depth of knowledge 4, which rarely are standards written to them, is that extended deep thinking and application, which includes multiple sources and connecting pieces over time. Almost always at that conceptual deep level. So if we look at a simple example, these 3 items, and we look at the word describe used each and every time, which is why we can't look at just the verb. Describe 3 main parts of a eukaryotic cell. Well, there's only 3. Or if even we just said, what are the main parts of a eukaryotic cell, and didn't even give that away, there's nucleus, there's cytoplasm, there's cell membrane. There's really nothing else. Describe the differences between plant cells and animal cells. Well, we can dig here a little bit. Certainly, there's a cell wall in an animal cell. Still has a cell membrane because it's eukaryotic. But animal cells have or plant cells have a larger vacuole for the most part, so they can store more water. Notice that I had to have that description as to why. I'm describing the differences. They have a larger vacuole doesn't tell me enough. I would expect the response to be because they will need to store more water because they'll need that to survive, and plants can't just go get a drink. As we all know that, but that's kind of a conceptual understanding for students, especially at the earlier ages. Asking them to describe a model that would represent the inner workings of a cell and how many different parts function together. Now we're definitely getting into a depth of knowledge 3. There's more than 1 right answer. There's more than 1 way that students can explain that. We're not at a DOK 4 because we're not talking about how one different parts of a cell, one cell interacts differently than another, such as example like nerve cells or blood cells or different cells in our body that will have different functions. Now we can actually take that, how that standard could be written, and build into a 4, but usually when we're connecting multiple standards together. So coming back to the CFA process, again, early on, this is the most important thing. It's the foundation. It's the one thing that I'm realizing even more now, even if we have multiple opportunities to come back together like we do here with this group working with Sam in South Dakota. This is something, if I could have pressed rewind, I'd have been even more intentional with. And I don't think it hurt us by default, although I want your thought on that. It's one thing for me to say it. I want to know where you are as the learners, but that becomes the anchor, that's got to be done first. And so when we uncover or unwrap the standards, and I only change the word uncovering so that way we realize when we say uncover, unwrap, unpack, deconstruct, Larry has used the term unwrapping, we're finding those critical elements because that will drive our purpose. Our purpose in any assessment has to come down to what is in that priority standard. Once it's unwrapped, what are the concepts, the nouns, and the skill level that they have to demonstrate that at? And then we write items to determine that we have enough evidence to make a quality inference. So I'm going to walk us through a few examples, and I usually start with this one. It's a language arts standard. Determine the central ideas or information of a primary or secondary source. Provide an accurate summary for how key events developed over the course of a text. First thing we'll always do is pull out the skills. What are the skills or the verbs that the students are going to have to do something with? And then we underline the nouns or the noun phrases. It's not just events, it's key events. In fact, it's not just summary, it's an accurate summary. So here, I've unwrapped the first part of my standard. I pulled out the nouns, and I've intentionally put the adjectives or part of the noun phrase in parentheses. Central idea, accurate summary. I did put primary source and secondary source specifically because the standard says provide information from a primary or secondary source. And we'll see that in some standards. So what that was telling to the teacher that you don't have to do both, but they got to do at least one. Key events, key ideas, text. Now we add the skills in, but what's critical is we have to add the skills with the content. So if you remember, if we go back to the standard, determine and provide. I want to be intentional here. We have to determine what? The central idea. Determine information from a primary source, determine information from a secondary source. The teacher would make the judgment call as to which one they're using. Now, we have to provide an accurate summary. I've added a caveat where we never want to add anything into the unwrapping. But if you have to provide a summary, well, then by default, you're going to have to summarize. No different if it said to summarize, you would have to understand the concept of a summary. If it said to make a prediction, you would have to know the concept of predict. If it tells you to predict, you'd have to make a prediction. It's really one of the only places where there's that a little bit of leeway. We don't, like science teachers understand this. When I'm teaching unwrapping, standards are like matter. They can't be created or destroyed. We can't take a piece of it or add something in. But it does say that we have to provide an accurate summary, and we have to summarize the key events over the text and the key ideas over the text. Now we have to take that piece and go to our cognitive rigor matrix, which you see up here in the upper right under around math and science. Now, we're not abandoning Benjamin completely. He's getting us in the ballpark where we use the verb to see, are we around that level? Now, one of the things I mentioned is the difference between a Bloom's 2 and a 3 is really nothing. So when you look at the verb, go in a couple of categories. So don't just get locked into one of those. But as we move across with DOK, as much as we can, we want to really see what we see here. And we got to remember, it's not going to be verbatim. But for the most part, as we look at the standard, do we see what the standard is written at and how we describe here what we're probably going to have the student do based on an understanding of that standard, which is why our content knowledge is so important. So for science, this is why we got to really understand our science content to teach it. But we still have to have enough knowledge around literacy because with almost every standard, students are going to have to explain or describe something to us. So if we come back here, we're going to go for each bullet point, and for the most part, we're at a DOK level 2 based on how they're written. More than one right answer, but there's going to need to be a justification. The events over the text is tighter than the ideas over the text. Key ideas over the text, we really could look at this at a DOK level 3. Now, when I write my assessment, I need to make sure I have enough evidence in my items to determine if students can meet these 3 elements of the skills, and if they can't, how far away are they? That doesn't mean that I have to do each one completely individually. It's very possible to ask students to summarize the ideas of the text and the events of the text in the same item. So I only started with that language arts one to remind us, number one, as science teachers, we're always going to need to incorporate the literacy standards as well, and we unwrap them the same way. But let's dig into some of our South Dakota science standards, and I've got at least one next generation science standard in here. We have a 4th grade standard, construct an argument that plants and animals have internal and external structures that function to support survival, growth, behavior, and reproduction. First, I pulled out my concepts. Argument, plants, animals, structures, and I put internal and external, survival, growth, behavior, and reproduction. That's all the nouns, the concepts, the content the students have to know. What they have to do is they have to construct an argument that plants have structures that support their survival. Plants have structures that support their growth. Plants have structures that support their behavior, reproduction, so on and so forth. And then the same thing with animals. So when we dig into a standard like this is why it's so important to really take the time to deconstruct it for 2 reasons. I think it's very possible, as we know as science teachers, some kids could construct an argument, hopefully, or we work on that first, and they can understand the piece about growth and behavior they're not there at reproduction, or they're not there at survival, or they can really do it well with animals but less with plants. Now I've got a roadmap for how I'm designing my assessment and my items to make sure I can determine that they've really mastered the standard. If they haven't, how far away are they? And argument is something that I might emphasize more in this unit and then less on the survival part, because argument is going to stick unit after unit. Here, what the teachers determined that really both of those are level 3 across the board. So if we can see and determine that each one of those, because sometimes the bullet points, for example, not in this case, but survival's at a 2 and growth is at a 3, we'd want to list it. But here, it's safe to say that we could agree that both of those are really at that DOK level 3. Let's look at the next generation assessment, or next generation science standard, just to have at least one of those on here as well. Construct and present arguments using evidence to support the claim that gravitational interactions are attractive and depend on the masses of interacting objects. Again, I love that term argument in there. Students understanding that, whether it's in science or English or math or even social studies, because I can argue, whether or not Atticus Finch was a good single parent. I'm not arguing with volume, I'm arguing with quality evidence. Our verbs, our skills, and then our nouns or noun phrases. It's not just interactions, it's gravitational interactions. Here we have our concepts. Now, I added this point, if you notice, where it talks about they are attractive. Not that they're good looking, one of Dave's bad jokes, but attractions. And I put that two asterisks there. I would highlight below in my assessment, to understand that they're attractive, I can understand the concept of attractions. Now we add our verbs. And we add our DOK. Construct the argument, present the argument, and use evidence. All three of these fall into that DOK level 3. The gravitational interactions are attractive and depend on the masses of interacting objects. Let's go on to one or two more. Here was a first grade standard. Read text and use media to determine that patterns and behavior of parents and offspring that help offspring survive. One thing that I think is very powerful about the South Dakota science standards is there's a lot of literacy elements embedded in them. With rare exception, I've seen that, and not all of them, but a lot of them. But I think that really is a compliment to the authors of those. And standards in and of themselves aren't good or bad. I cringe at the conversations folks have about the Common Core standards. It's about the implementation. It's about other things that get in the way. But here, the literacy standards sometimes are deeply embedded in them. Excuse me. So again, I just did this one as a whole. Left side, we have our concepts. Down the middle, we have our skills, the verbs, and what they're linked to. And then every once in a while, we're right on that precipice. And it's not just chickening out and not being able to make a stand, but when we say read texts, it's very difficult for me, as I did this one with a couple of teachers, to determine, is that at a 1 or a 2? Because it's not saying what we're going to have to do. What does it mean by read the text? I could read it. The only way I know you've read it, I got to check for understanding that you could determine the patterns and the behavior from the text, determine the patterns, behavior, and offspring, and help them survive. So we kind of left that one at a 1 or a 2 based on how we will use the text to be able to meet the next part of that standard, and certainly at a first grade level, but any level, but just specifically mentioning first grade, that readability factor is going to come into play, because I might be focusing more, if this is my science unit, on those science concepts, or I might be focusing more on the literacy piece, certainly at all levels, but the primary developmental level to get that reading skill down, and science is just my construct to do that. So again, pause in the reflection question if you have a chance and you're working with a group to review the unwrapping of a standard and unwrapping standard piece. Please take time to pause and do so. I just want to mention a couple final pieces. The acid test is when 2 or more educators come up with relatively the same level of context, rigor, and agreement of stills when unwrapping the standard. So I really encourage us when we're working in our teams, and it's not about somebody unwrapping all of the standards. When we think about it, when we're going to take 2 or 3 of these standards for a 3 or 4 week unit, it's going to take us maybe 10 minutes or so before the start of the unit to unwrap them, and that should be something we would do every time. So I would just really challenge the notion that we want someone to unwrap all of our standards for us. We need to have an understanding of them. But I think it's important that maybe we go into the unit, we each unwrap the same one, and we say, how close or how far away were we to determine, okay, well, we're on the same relative page, because then as we drive down the road, start building our assessment, we're more inclined to be able to have agreement down the road as well, as the assessment items are written towards those concepts, skills, and accurate rigor level. As always, please feel free to shoot me an email. I left my Core 1 email on the first slide. Here's my other email. I check them both all the time. If you have a thought or a question, not only throughout this work here in the fall, but going on forward, never hesitate to reach out. Very excited and honored to work with all of you. It's been a great journey so far, and I'm really looking forward to the 2 days we have coming up here this fall. Thanks so much. Have an awesome rest of your day.